My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by the man behind all of USA Weightlifting's biomechanics work in Marquette, Christoph Kipp. Christoph, how you doing?
Doing well, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited to dig into this because I know social media is interesting. You'll see things pop up that you never expected or you're unsure of, and you can't figure it out, like, because you don't have anyone to explain it. It's just like there's no context, there's no background information, there's no information on what's going on. But you start seeing USA Weightlifting like pull videos from Marquette, and they're like, "Oh, we're doing some work on technique." You're like, "Okay, well, what's going on? Like, what really is going on behind the scenes?" And I thought it'd be great to have this opportunity to chat with someone who's heavily involved in the space of research on the topics of and looking at, potentially answering a lot of questions that coaches and researchers in weightlifting could have or would have. And before we do all that, always like to get a proper background to understand kind of the context of where this is coming from. So what is your interest currently? Where did they develop from, or where did they stem from?
Really, really fun question, right? It makes you think back to all the things that are in your past to some extent. So I don't know how far you want me to go back, but most of the work that we currently do revolves around biomechanics of weightlifting, right, as a sport, and then track and field throwing events specifically. And I guess my interest in both of those topics sort of just came from my personal background as being a high school and collegiate thrower. So using weightlifting as a means to an end as part of the training process. When I was an undergraduate student at Boise State, I had a friend in the same program. He was a weightlifter, an actual weightlifter. And he was training with the Idaho Weightlifting Club, which was run by Mike Conroy for many years, and probably still is. I haven't talked to him in a long time. And so we started an undergraduate research project on weightlifting biomechanics. And so I should say that my friend is Josh Redden, who is now LSU Shreveport and works with Kyle down there. And that's sort of how we started down the weightlifting route, collected some data as part of this project, and I've been chipping away at research related to weightlifting biomechanics ever since.
Yeah. How do you develop? So, for people who are listening who maybe haven't been involved in like graduate school or graduate level courses and research, you try to develop a research line and say like, okay, where am I going to shift some of my focus to? Basically like what's my specialty? How did you find that evolving over time, right? Because the biomechanics of weightlifting can look a lot of different ways. And maybe you would have, even better perspective on how it could look a lot of different ways. But when you started getting into it, what were the questions that you were asking? And then how did that change over time to kind of create this like through line of the work that you do?
Yeah, so going back to that very first research project that was really Josh's idea, or Josh and Mike kind of came up with this idea of trying to compare different warm-up strategies when you're in the back room on the training hall for weightlifting meet. They're interested in comparing the effects of either doing, was it a power clean or a pull in terms of sort of potentiating or trying to stay warm during competition, right, instead of doing full attempts in the back. And so I still sort of think back and I can't believe that some of our supervisors let us do this in the lab, that we were able to take up the floor. We built a weightlifting platform around force plates in the ground. brought weightlifters into the lab. We had a sort of warm-up platform out in the garage of the engineering school, and we would shuttle people in and out and trying to simulate a competition essentially.
Wow.
And so we had force plates that were sort of embedded within a platform. We had a motion analysis system that we used for bar tracking. For part of that, we also used markers that we placed on the person, on the lifter themselves, to try to get an idea of their overall movement patterns. So at the time, I was probably a little bit more it was kind of a moonshot where we didn't really know all the things that we'd be able to do. We just thought these are all biomechanics tools that people use. So that was really the first project. Another sort of small side project that we did after that one, the final year, as I was transitioning from my undergraduate to my master's degree, where I stayed in the same lab, so we were able to continue some of this work. Where again, we staged a weightlifting competition. Mike Conroy at the time called it the Greater Biomechanical Open at Boise, Idaho. And just the thought of, we really wanted to see what do people do when they're under pressure in competition, right? And there are things that you do in training, everything looks great. You get into competition, and depending on the lifter, right, sometimes things just go awry, and that's sort of what he wanted to essentially just check out, right? What are some of the differences that we see? So initially, when we looked at that data, I think the main questions sort of revolved around this idea of warm-up strategies, what is done in competition. The analyses that we used were pretty much sort of a continuation of a lot of the sort of seminal work by John Garhammer, looking at power outputs, some bar path analysis. But the lab that we did this in, some of the other projects that I was helping with, they were using the biomechanical data to look at joint kinematic and kinetic data. And so you're able to calculate joint angles as well as net joint moments, right? And the combination of those two really allow you to move from a more descriptive sense of, right, these are the movement patterns that we observe. You're able to get at what are the sort of muscular contributions to the movement themselves, right? So what is the sort of concentric, eccentric pattern of knee extension or the knee extensors during the pull, right? And so you're able to then dial in on sort of first pull, transition, second pull mechanics at a very detailed level. So, which then allows you to do things like qualitatively and quantitatively assess energy storage during the second pull, right? How much of a conceivably how much of a stretch shortening cycle there is during that phase. And then you can then put numbers to that.
The mission of Weightlifting House is to bring the sport of weightlifting closer to the coaches, fans, and athletes. They're able to do this by supporting the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast. You can use the code PHILWL, that's PHILWL, at the USA Weightlifting House store. That will save you 10% off all products, including bars, straps, wraps, singlets, and anything else you could imagine. That is PHILWL, PHILWL, to save 10% off everything at the Weightlifting House store. And by supporting the podcast, you support Weightlifting House. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of directions we can take this, and I'm definitely curious to know. And there are a lot of questions that I have because I was writing a paper for a class at this point, probably a few weeks ago, because time just, it's an illusion, it seems. And it was about, I would say it's biomechanics, but it was like, how do you break down the phases of the lift? And you can look at a bunch of different sources and hear people describe them differently. And if you pull different papers, you'll see them written about differently. And if you look in different like pop weightlifting books, you'll see them written about differently. My recollection of like the best description was in one of the Russian manuals, and it kind of talked about like the instant of separation, the bar and athlete become the system kind of become one, and then up to kind of the first maximal knee extension, and then you kind of walk through the phases like that. As someone who's studied this a lot for a very long time and thought a lot about it, and I would love to get into the application side at some point, but like even just forgetting that, just from a like a like a researcher's lens, how would you describe the lift in terms of like being broken into different phases to better understand it and then to study it?
Yeah, so I'm going to lean heavily on Sham Chavda, who, shout out, just defended his PhD dissertation
Awesome.
at Middlesex University. Job well done. And that was sort of part of his dissertation, part of that process where he did a review looking at this initially. And sort of what you're pointing out is that there are many different phases, many different ways to define the phases in weightlifting. And I think it gets complicated because some people will use or rely solely on barbell mechanics. Some will use a combination of knee joint mechanics, or exclusively one or the other, or a combination thereof. And so I agree, it sort of becomes difficult if we don't all use the same, I'd say not the same terminology, but sometimes people talk about these phases differently. One thing that sort of stuck with me is that I think probably a good way to go about it is to think about what are the sort of movement goals that you're trying to achieve during each part of the phase. And with that, right, maybe from the coaching application side, is that what data do you have access to? It's certainly right if you're sort of always recording video, sagittal plane, side on view, you may not have access to knee joint angle to make decisions based on, or to use knee joint angles to base a decision or your phase classification on. Right, so it becomes a little bit difficult to say this is first knee extension during the pull, right, flexion, and then sort of trying to figure out when the transition phase occurs. So one way to go to sort of circumvent that is to only go with barbell kinematics. With barbell kinematics, only looking at barbell trajectory or velocity patterns, you're sort of then at the mercy of whether or not the person has a noticeable velocity decrease during the transition phase. If they don't, it becomes really difficult to reliably identify first pull and second pull. That said, right, stepping back, we can still identify the entire pull phase, first pull, transition, and second pull, pretty easily just from barbell kinematic data. We can obviously get peak height of the barbell, so we can identify turnover phase and then the catch phase as well. So oftentimes I think of just very simply, we have three sort of major phases. We have the pulling phase, which we can, again, subdivide. We have the turnover phase, which we often describe as the point of maximal vertical velocity, so end of basically your sort of triple extension, to maximal downward velocity after the bar has reached peak height. Some people refer to that also as the reposition phase, right? So you're essentially, it's the time it takes you to reposition your body from creating maximal upward velocity to slowing down the sort of quote unquote crash velocity, right? The bar coming crashing down on you. And then the catch phase is just you slowing down the barbell to essentially zero velocity. And so with that sort of simple definition, the three-phase definition, right? If somebody exhibits a very noticeable decrease in the barbell velocity during the transition phase, we can then classify that in a little bit more detail, first pull, the transition phase. We could also look at the turnover phase as, and depending on what literature you read, some people will refer to this as the third pull. So the sort of the force that you apply on the barbell after you have sort of imparted maximal vertical velocity. I think it's often a misconception that the maximal vertical velocity that the barbell has at the end of the second pull is enough to bring the barbell to maximum height. Right? So if you just did pure or just straight up projectile motion calculations, that peak velocity that somebody achieves is actually only about 70 to 90% of the velocity that's needed to bring the bar to peak height for you to then drop under and reposition and catch the barbell. So you could look at that third pull essentially as the interval, right? And we do this for some of our analyses to get an idea of how much additional work the lifter does on the bar, which from a sort of coaching or practical application might tell you something about how connected the athlete stays to the bar, how aggressively they pull under as well. Presumably after the end of the second pull, if the feet completely separate from the floor, you're sort of a closed system that's, for lack of a better term, floating in the air, right? So any sort of additional force that the lifter is applying to the bar to increase the vertical velocity means that they have to counter that with that impulse up with impulse down. So we get an idea of how fast the lifter is dropping beneath the bar. And then after peak height, as velocity sort of increases, downward velocity increases, we still see that there is an active sort of contribution of work being done on the bar until the lifter repositions their feet, where they are then in the position to sufficiently slow the barbell down to like zero velocity. So from peak height down to catch phase, there's technically 2 phases. And if you sort of combine all this with the motions of the barbell, the velocity and the accelerations, you're able to sort of tease out what the lifter is functionally doing, right? If velocity and acceleration are both in the same direction, it means that you're adding a propulsive force to the barbell. But if velocity and acceleration are in opposite, I shouldn't say opposite directions, but they're opposite signs. So vertical velocity, but acceleration is actually negative, it means there's a braking phase. And so, you could do that sort of analysis for the pulling phase, for the turnover, and for the catch phase as well.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
Yeah. Are there any references or papers you would push people toward to check out and kind of read into this a bit further to provide a little more context?
Yeah, I believe a large part of this is in one of Sham's articles that was published in the Strength and Conditioning Journal, and sort of an applied technical model for weightlifting, for assessing weightlifting biomechanics, I believe.
Okay,
so that would be a good point to start.
Okay, and I'll drop a link to that in the description for people who are interested. Which I've read that. I made infographics about it. It's a great paper.
Yes,
truly it is, and I think it kind of it acts as a nice bridge between a lot of the the nuance, and then what does this look like and how is it applied, which is in the title. So I think it's a great descriptor of that.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously digging into this question a lot more, thinking from a coaching standpoint, from a purely coaching standpoint, sometimes you might hear, why is it necessary to know this? Or why is it necessary to have, these aren't the questions, but they kind of revolve around the same point of why is it important to have agreed upon language that reflects the kinetics and kinematics of what's happening? I've been saying first pull, second pull, third pull, or whatever it may be, and that works for me.
Mm-hmm.
So from a researcher standpoint, and then also taking into consideration the coaching perspective, why would it be important to have fleshed out, agreed upon language, and to understand what's happening, more toward the way that you're describing it? I know you're not saying that, but why would it be helpful to have that versus, we have, the pull to the knee, pull to the hip, you pull under?
Yeah, I think there are probably a couple different ways you could take that answer, right? I think there's probably a difference between consistency in naming things and then consistency of calculating things in a way, right? So if you say, as an example, I said when I mentioned the third pull, I know one of the sort of original articles by the sort of group out of Finland, right? Häkkinen and Komi, they didn't call the transition phase a transition phase. They called that the second pole. And so their third pole is our second pole, right? Um, so I don't think, right, if you have different names, it can just, I guess the issue is that it can be potentially confusing, but just because you have different language doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong as long as you're being consistent. Right, and so that's what I'd say. If we're talking with coaches, and again, oftentimes when we have these conversations with coaches based on the data that we collect, sometimes they say, right, here's a barbell velocity profile. This is the terminology that I use. If you have questions or if you use a different term, please let me know so we can sort of get on the same page. And as part of that, actually, I think it's interesting because again, when I talked about the turnover phase, when I talked about this idea of being able to quantify, quote unquote, how connected the lifter is to the barbell, that's actually something that came out of the conversations that we've had with some coaches and some people from USA Weightlifting. And I actually like that idea of like getting at how it allows us a way to quantify, quote unquote, how connected somebody is, right? So I think it's a really good way to then communicate with coaches. So I think it goes both ways, definitely, right? If the coaches that have different ways of, right, this is I'm making this up right now. This is the connection phase or phase where I'm looking for connectivity, right? That then may help us reframe how we present this as well. And that sort of then, I think, gets into the second part of, as long as we can sort of agree on that there are different phases, we just want to be consistent in how we calculate those so that we can, or how we define those so that when we make calculations, we can be consistent and say like, right, even things like how far back or forward is the bar at the end of the first pull, right? Or during the second pull, whether or not you call that the transition or whatever it might be. If we want to be able to quantify things that occur during those phases, right, different variables, or if we want to calculate other things like work done during a specific phase, is just really helpful to be consistent in that and the definition.
Yeah, and I think maybe in a one-off situation in which you're just saying like this is what's occurring, it's different to say like, yeah, you can kind of use whatever language you want, but as soon as you start to compare across time, you're right, like to be able to accurately compare two different points of the pole, you would have to have that held constant to some extent. So if you're looking at like either describing something across time or changing it across time, you'd have to be able to measure it reliably. And if you have a different language, you might have different points of reference, which would lead to different measurements, which wouldn't be looking at the same value or looking at the same thing impacted by an intervention, basically. So
exactly.
From your perspective, I think, shout out to Dane Miller. You were recently on, kind of like involved with him and had some work with him, I think, a podcast, and he's kind of referenced you in podcasts I've listened to on the I think it's the Garage Strength podcast, which is really cool. I really enjoy listening to it. So I'd push people there if they want to learn more about strength and conditioning and weightlifting. But they kind of make this funny reference about white coats, and it's like, in practice, what are we doing? And then what would the white coat say? And you're an academic. You study the biomechanics of weightlifting. So I don't know if they would bucket you as a white coat. But where do you think I'm just kind of curious to know where you think the disconnect would be between, we describe how you would create a model of understanding and explaining the lift. You would then use that across time to track changes and intervene on the model itself and say like, okay, how can we manipulate velocities? How can we manipulate timings? And then we could maximize efficiency, maximize work done. And then we could create better weightlifters or better weightlifting. Do you think there is something to that point about like, well, this is what researchers or research will say, and this is what we've noticed in practice? Those can be conflicting. Or do you think it's more a matter of translation? So maybe you can start with like, why do you think there would be this idea of like, well, there are the white coats and then there are coaches, and then, there's a disconnect or divide between the two?
Yeah, I was going to say I will. While you were talking, I was going to text Dane and ask him, am I considered a white coat or not? I when I did that podcast with him, I'm pretty sure I made sort of a self-deprecating reference about us being here in the ivory tower of Marquette University. So I get that sentiment, and I do hear it a lot. And I won't pretend that like when I started out, right, that I don't say I had a chip on my shoulder, but you definitely like this is the sort of science, right, with biomechanics, F equals ma, right? That's sort of like pretty well established. That said, somebody asked me like, what are some of the things that we've learned in working with some of the elite athletes in USA weightlifting and now in track and field, and I think immediately you wanted to jump to things like here are very specific insights about the movement mechanics, right? Things that lead to bigger lifts, further throws, but almost more globally, I think it's made me and hopefully my graduate students who are involved with some of this research too, just better sort of biomechanists in the sense that it's helped us with that, science communication and translational piece. And something that I do hear, or I've heard from people before, is that many people have been part of elite athlete projects where biomechanists, right, or physiologists, really any sort of person in a sports science capacity comes in. They do measurements, they record, video, they assess different physical qualities. Then they go off, they run their reports, they look to write some papers. And then when they report back, it's oftentimes not in a reasonable time frame. I mean, whenever you ask coaches, like, when would you like this data? They say, tomorrow morning on my desk, please. But it takes a long time to turn things around. And then oftentimes it's sort of, again, it's with a chip on the shoulder and thinking that this is you compared to our biomechanical model, and here is a list of things that you're doing wrong, instead of a more sort of conversational
right.
dialogue, if you will. And I think that's something that over the last 3 years we've come to do much better in the reports that we generate for some weightlifters, and try to make it more conversational rather than here, right, the sort of traditional biomechanical analysis, if you will. Here's some data, here's some time series, here's the average, here's you, this is bad, right? So I think those are all sort of things that are definitely, are definitely out there, right? They definitely happen, and so we're just trying to be cognizant of those.
Yeah. How do we improve that aspect of, we have a bunch of measurement tools. Science is basically the process of dividing the world into more and more discrete pieces and parts to then measure it and track changes and then say, how's that change impacted by an intervention or something that's occurring in the broader sense of like what's going on. And you're right, it can feel overly descriptive sometimes, which I know that's a part of the process. There's a good paper I actually read recently, and it was given to me by my chair, Dr. Hornsby. And it's like an applied model for research in the sports sciences. And it was by Baker, I don't know his first name, but it basically talks about descriptive research as being one of the first steps. It's like understanding what we're looking at, what like quote unquote normative values would be. And I feel like that could also be a complaint of all we have is descriptive research that's telling us, well, this is what people generally are doing. But, how does that impact? How does that impact what we do on the pitch or on the field or on the court or on the platform? And also, coming from someone who's read a lot of this research and coached a lot and is in the process of conducting research, you realize there's a strong difficulty in doing anything that can change performance, right? Because there's so many confounding variables, and there's such different contexts in which all of this occurs. So, like, sterilize the environment, you can potentially bring it so far away from sports that you lose that connection or that relationship. Good examples would be you do some sort of intervention, you track changes in different hormones, and it's like, well, what impact does that truly have? And then, how's that applicable to coaches who are, in a CrossFit gym, but are like high level weightlifting coaches? So to you, what is that process of conducting effective research that can be kind of one step behind what we need, but is that step to eventually get there, and then translating it to real life practice where all coaches, not just the coaches in the ivory towers who are being kind of like able to recruit the best athletes and have the resources and can allocate them toward, force plates or testing, or who get invited to different camps, but all coaches who can say, this is tangible research, tangible work that allows me to improve the process by which I develop athletes, not only at the highest level, because it's not like, as a coach, you think, I'm going to take this information and only apply it to my elite athletes. Like, that's the lens by which you view all weightlifting from that point on. You can't, eliminate knowledge or subtract knowledge. How do we impact all coaches in this space and empower them with the work that you're doing, basically?
Express the passion that defines you. At Virus, we understand that when it comes to performance, the slightest edge can mean the difference between winning and losing. Each product is designed and tested with performance in mind. This principle inspired the technology that is infused into our apparel. Built with the intention to move with you and work for you, we create tools meant to help express the passion that defines you. The future of technology-driven apparel. Improve performance, prevent fatigue, recover faster, and go further. Virus is a proud sponsor of Josh Gibson and the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. Use code PHILWL for 10% off at checkout. That's PHILWL, PHILWL, for 10% off.
Yeah, I try to keep a mental list of all the things I wanted to respond to, because I thought there are like 5 or 6 great points I think that you raised in there. So I think, I guess in terms of the breadth of coaches, I always have to, oftentimes when we talk about our work in weightlifting, I always have to say most of this is only applicable to weightlifting as a sport, right? Weightlifting for the sort of CrossFit community, the level of applicability probably decreases quite a bit.
Right.
Or even using weightlifting as a form of, as a tool within that strength and conditioning setting. So that's oftentimes a qualifier that I have to make. We're saying this is directly applicable to the sport of weightlifting, especially when we talk about the context of calculating and measuring certain parameters that are related to technique or performance outcomes. In terms of, I mean, sort of cliche, right? Bridging the gap better. I think it comes down to spending time with stakeholders, right? So spending time with coaches, with the athletes, trying to listen a little bit more, be around for water cooler type of conversations. And this is where oftentimes when we do have camps here that we run for some of the lifters from USA Weightlifting, I am always super appreciative of my graduate students that help out. Right now we have Wanda and Emma, big shout out to them as well, that they run the system, and I sort of try to be hands off as much as I can. One, for letting them sort of learn how to collect data, run the equipment. But then I also say I tend to, it allows me to float around and talk to different people. Right? So I'm able to talk a little bit more with Mike Atone if he's here, some of the other strength coaches from the USOPC, and again, do that sort of informal sort of chit chat in between, right? As people are doing, as they're participating in the research process, or participating in those camps. And so part of that, I guess, in terms of there was one piece, I forget exactly what you said about it, made me think of like ecological validity, right? Is that there's certainly some of the earlier research that I mentioned that we used to do were sort of very lab-based in a more quote-unquote sterile equipment or sterile environment, devoid of any sort of context, maybe, or like a competition setting. So that's where when we do have the camps here, there's one day that we call our heavy singles day where Mike Atone will pretty much run it like a competition, which makes it really easy for us to sort of keep track of who's doing what. And so he has a list of sort of attempts that some of the lifters will try to make. And he'll sort of call them up and give them it's like sort of like counting cards. So it's like, you're so many attempts out, this is where you're going to be. And depending on how many people per weight class there are, you do have a little bit of sort of back and forth and friendly competition. Some guys going up against each other and trying to push each other a little bit. And then in terms of, I guess, sort of the last point in trying to have that trickle down, right, into sort of broader context of the weightlifting community, it's something that we're sort of very cognizant of as well. Where this is in collecting data here during camp as weightlifters come in for when we have the camps here on campus. Again, we have our weight room that's I want to say the weight room is instrumented, but some of the platforms in the weight room are instrumented with force plates as well. So we're able to measure ground reaction forces during full lifts, essentially. We bring in our motion capture system to do barbell tracking. And we have a markerless motion capture system as well that allows us to look at joint kinematics. So it just generates a ton of data. And we're sort of hindered by the fact that it is a ton, it's a lot to wade through to do the analyses. So the first priority is always, right, at this point, there's Mike Atone is the high performance director, right? One of the main sort of aspects of his job is trying to increase the number of medals at the Olympics that USA Weightlifting wins. And so first priority is sort of generating reports, trying to provide feedback for those lifters. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, it's really taken us a while, or it's been a process trying to hone those reports of how to best present that information as well. Certainly a good example would be that no matter how many fancy figures or graphs that we generate, coaches will always want to watch the video. Right. And so having video with then, for example, overlays of the barbell trajectory or force application or force vectors to get an idea of what is the direction of force being applied to the pole in different phases. Center of pressure translation under the foot, right? If we have some asymmetries in ground reaction forces, again, during different phases of the pole. Those are things that none of us are really computer programmers, but we sort of are able to, what's the word? It's we're able to sort of bushwhack our way through, by pure force sort of programming. It's like, I know we can do this. There's probably a way that you can do this in 5 lines of code and it takes us 100, but we get there.
Yeah.
But so that's sort of by the list of priorities. But again, when we do have these ongoing conversations, it would be great to be able to summarize this data in digestible information for the masses in a way, right? For coaches within USA Weightlifting, like for the membership. I know for one of the last, so Anna Swisher, who runs part of the coaching education for USA Weightlifting, she had one of our graduate students present to some of the coaches at I think a level 2 certification. So this is sort of us trying to bring some of this information back. I joked with her a little bit and said, I think we'll be at the national championships in June, I said, right, maybe we should set up a booth of like a biomechanics AMA and just see who shows up. And she's like, you might be sorry if you did that. But yeah, so if people have thoughts and ideas about how to do that, totally open to that as well. But it's sort of, again, it's an ongoing process. It's on our radar screen, and we definitely like to get there, right, to be able to diffuse some of the information out.
No, and I think that's a great summary of almost the process by which it's changed over time. Talking about more of like a sterile environment, void of context, and then leading into something that almost replicates a competition along with the data collection. And then, that's one thing Dr. Hornsby kind of will mention, like, you can have all these numbers, but with sport coaches, when you're in like an S&C setting, it's like, have some graphs, like have something where you can visualize it and say like, well, here was pre, here's post. You can see a difference, you can notice a difference, and it's obvious. So I think that's, these things are kind of thought about and perceived to be overlooked, but I think people are working on them. I would love, as you and your lab kind of release work to have this as like a recurrent feature of the podcast, because the one thing I noticed, I don't listen to weightlifting podcasts, funnily enough, but there's one called the Mind and Matter podcast, and the Nick Jahomis, the guy who runs it, he's I think he has a PhD in neuroscience, but he brings on people from like people of far-ranging areas of expertise I would have never heard about otherwise, and they talk about such interesting topics and all related to the research, really, like from aging to stress and resilience to all these topics. I would never ever know they existed as people who do good work in the space unless they came on the podcast and talked about it. So as an avid podcast consumer, I think this is incredibly valuable. I'll also be at Nationals with Max Ada, who I know you had a phone call with him and Chris recently, and we're going to have a booth as well. I think it would be really cool to do some podcasts, like live podcasts, and then also just to engage with people who are there, because I think there's a lot of good work done, and I'm always surprised by the publications I can find where it's like, oh, here's a breakdown, a review of elite performance, and it's like, I didn't know people thought about or wrote about or studied or understood elite performance in this way. And I think that's kind of what I've been attempting to do out of curiosity, is from start to finish. It's been, whoa, there's a lot of really cool data and information relating to weightlifting performance that I would have never thought people have studied and thought about and written about. How do we get that out of, out of ResearchGate, out of Google Scholar, out of PubMed, out of all these places, and make it more open access? And that's kind of where I see my role as being. But I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, how do we just get it out of the sort of traditional academic track, period? Yeah. I think that's it's a big barrier, right, that I see. And it's sort of a necessary evil in a way if you're in academia, right? There's certainly an expectation that you are being productive on the research side, right? And being productive in academia, there are certain metrics that people will use, right? So number of publications is one. The publication process isn't always the easiest to navigate, and there's certainly a lag. There can be influenced by biases. That reviewer number 3, lots of memes about that. In terms of feedback, right? It does serve its purpose, not denigrating that, but it, I think, creates a barrier in a sense that it probably keeps some of the research from getting out. For better or worse, and this is probably a whole nother sort of podcast topic, right? And it's like publishing in academia or the peer review process. But I think one thing that I've sort of mulled over is what is the best way to spread some of this information? Traditionally, based on sort of traditional academic training, it's trying to get things published in papers. But is that always the best way? I'm not so sure. And so, right, the question then comes up, what are the alternatives? And so, sharing things on blogs, I don't know if blogs are a thing anymore, really, in the sense that they were, right, when I was in grad school. Social media, Twitter, Instagram, right, where again you might be lacking some context or some depth to that information. So I've been trying to mull that over in terms of, or releasing white papers or other sort of, like I said, digestible bits of biomechanical insights. Like, how do we best get this out there without having to rely on the academic publishing process, not having it behind paywall at a journal, or, like you said, you mentioned sort of bringing it, not making everybody go to ResearchGate or Google Scholar. So it's something that I'm certainly mulling over. Fortunately for me, the point at where I'm at in my career, and that sort of the traditional academic research / publishing, that sort of trying to think of, is it a mandate, or right, having to do that or follow that process is less important at this point in my career. Right. So this is probably allows me to think more about these things.
I think personally, from a coaching perspective, and what I've attempted to do, and what I think Max has done really, really well is, and this is kind of where my mind was when you were talking about this, is, it's not like people choose to do this. I say choose to do this, that's very vague, but like choose to write scientifically or academically as they do because, that's their preference. I think it becomes preferential because you get used to it. But it's a lot of it really is being able to communicate clearly and consistently and correctly. And in doing that, when you're describing the function of skeletal muscle, it's like you kind of have to talk about it in a way that's like can be hard to translate or understand if you're not familiar with it. It's like, what is sarcomere, calcium, like this, all this stuff doesn't make sense. But you write that way so that people who are trained can understand it. And then, you try to give it to the public. And I say you give it to the public. You try to hand it to coaches, and it's like, it's really tough to understand. So there has to be that process of from science, to practice, that translation process. And what Max has done is Max, one's been embedded in practice for decades, training with Ivan Abajev and Steve Goff and, Boris Shako, and maxing his front squat 8 times a day for a decade or whatever, which is ridiculous. But he's also so engaged and so interested in the science, and asking questions and developing answers and theory and how that relates. And he's kind of used that to then write like pop weightlifting books, the Technique Triad, and we have the Weightlifter's Guide to the Snatch, and working on the companion, the Weightlifter's Guide to the Clean and Jerk. And you can kind of like diffuse in there lightly, more academic or jargony kind of topics, but you can keep it kind of like casual and conversational. And I think people really like that. And I bring up Jordan Peterson from time to time, and people get kind of up in arms, or they could get up in arms. I think he has a lot of really interesting and smart things he says. But he talks about, he had this lecture series or this talk series with Sam Harris. And he's like, the number of people who signed up and came, and the number of people who were interested in these like deep, rigorous academic, like theoretical talks. It's mind blowing. It's mind blowing how many people are interested in listening to the stuff or understanding it. And sometimes I think this dichotomy of like researchers, academics, coaches, you lose sight of like how many weightlifters are getting into academia or got into it. Dr. Hornsby played football, collegiate football. He threw national level weightlifter, and then got into kind of academia and has been publishing for a really long time. Like, it's not that, someone is interested in science and they happen to throw a dart at weightlifting. It's like, I competed in weightlifting, like myself, competed in weightlifting for a long time, coach it for a long time. Okay, academia provides a lot of things weightlifting can't. Let's connect and unite the two. So I think that dichotomy is kind of like a bit of a straw man. So I hear you talk about this, and it's like, how do I bring this to light? All this information, it's great information, which I'll like to kind of ask you about after you respond to this. But it's just having that like ebook vibe of, it's a casual publication. I think James Cleather, I didn't read them, but he had a couple books on like force or something. And like, I hear people reference those all the time. But, I have Principles and Practice of Resistance Training right in front of me from Stone, and Sands. It's like, no one references that. Like the big, dense textbook, the hardy kind of like things that like I enjoy are tough, but like, those casual kind of like flip through, thumb through 80, 100, 120 page books, like those do really well. And I think people really want those. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I agree. I think that's probably not that much more to add. I mean, I think what you're just describing is sort of, again, just piggybacks on what I was mentioning with just finding different ways to share that information. One thing that I just wanted to add real quick is that I said, so I'm fortunate to be in this position right now where it probably isn't about the number of articles anymore, right? So it allows me to think along these lines a little bit more of what you're describing too. It's like, how do we best share this information? That said, I still struggle with, right, training graduate students. For them, it still sort of is about that. So there's a little bit of tension of, you still have to try to get them to, right, they still have to write a dissertation that is, right, hopefully leads to a couple of publishable papers. If they want to go into academia, they should have a line of research that lends itself to publications, research, right, pursuing research funding, etc. But yeah, no, I agree. I have very similar feelings about some of the textbooks that are out there, and some of the more applied books, right? That I certainly, when you talk about muscle, there's the sarcomeres, muscle physiology. I mean, there's the sort of basic textbook that you open up and you have sarcomeres, length tension relationship, force velocity relationship. And you're like, for one, at the whole body level, right, force velocity relationship doesn't hold up that well. Not to say that there isn't a load velocity relationship, but some of the principles from basic muscle physio don't quite translate that well. But that said, one of my favorite books that I ever read was it Prime Mover, I believe, by Stephen Vogel.
I haven't heard
Prime Mover, The History of Muscle, that goes through basic muscle physiology, some musculoskeletal architecture, biomechanics, and it was an amazing read.
Yeah.
And it was sort of a pop science book, right? And yeah, I think doesn't mean that you have to do, right, like I said, even 150, 180 page books on weightlifting, but shorter vignettes or the best term that I have is sort of white papers, where it's a couple of pages, short abstracts, lots of nice visuals.
Yeah.
I'll try to illustrate some of these things.
And that's like when I kind of started getting into more of the academic side of things, like I just go to this place called Half Price Books. They're kind of all over the Midwest, and I'd get, their companion series, but it was like the female brain and the male brain, and just talk about like neuroscience and kind of differences. All those like pop science books are great, so much fun to read and so interesting, and you can tie in stories and kind of paint a lot of pictures. Yeah. And this kind of brings me to the question I think that would kind of give us a nice jumping off point to kind of round out the podcast, which would be, where do you feel like the state of the weightlifting is with regard to biomechanical research? I mean, what kind of questions are we asking? What kind of questions are we answering? And then, the next obvious like step from that is, where are we going with it? So I think a lot of people will reference kind of the researchers you mentioned earlier on the podcast, Hakkinen, in some of the earlier work with Garhammer. But we don't hear that as much now. So what kind of questions are we asking and answering, and where do you see us going with that in the future?
Yeah, great question. It's almost like I've had to mull this over again myself, because we had from some of the earlier projects we did, they sort of follow this series of, as you sort of mentioned, very descriptive weightlifting biomechanics, looking at the effect of load on joint kinematics, joint kinetics, trying to look at movement patterns more globally, right? So instead of being sort of reductionistic and saying, your knee at this point in the pull is in this position, right? We try to look at the whole movement pattern throughout the entire lift, but then also looking at the movement patterns at multiple joints together, right? So we used a sort of statistical machine learning type of technique where we were able to look at pattern. It's almost like a pattern recognition type algorithm where you can quantify the amount of triple extension pattern that a lifter exhibits, right? And so you get a quote unquote score for that pattern. How does that pattern change across lifts? So it's maybe a little bit more basic science motivated, but that's sort of, again, being in traditional academia, that was sort of part of that, where it came out of that thought process of having that background. Looking at more some of the, not just, and maybe moving away from the descriptive side of things, looking at more the determinants of movement, the joint kinetics. So looking at net joint moments, how do the sort of extensor muscle groups of the lower extremity control or coordinate the overall movement pattern? How does that lead to really, how does that result in the different phases? The coupling of sort of concentric and eccentric work throughout the pulling phase. The question that I still sort of have that we try to answer with again with more sort of statistical techniques is, right, we know that there is some amount of extension at our ankle, knee, and hip, right? That varies to a degree, right, depending on how much somebody plantar flexes maybe, or how much they extend the hip during the second pull. But one really sort of interesting question is, how much does the movement pattern at each of those joints contribute to the actual motion of the barbell?
Yeah.
How much does, and then by extension, no pun intended, by extension, looking at, right, so when you have knee extensor moments, knee extensor force that's being created, how much does that contribute to vertical acceleration of the barbell? And perhaps more interestingly, like horizontal motion of the barbell, right? In the 3D sort of multi-articular system, the forces that the muscles produce, right, lead to rotational forces at the joints, so also the net joint moments. And based on sort of the position that you're in, the moments can create horizontal or vertical motion at different points along the chain, if you will. And so there are some ways that we've tried to look at trying to quantify that, for example, right? So plantar flexors and hip extensors, for example, seem to be some of the main contributors to sort of horizontal translation of the center of mass, or the system, the center of mass of the system of the barbell / lifter system. Whereas knee extensors seem to be the ones that are responsible for backward translation. And then again, it's a combination, right, of horizontal and vertical motion that then also has to be timed correctly. So a lot of sort of interesting things to sort of pull apart from there, and that was sort of where we almost ended on in our sort of line of research before starting this work with USA Weightlifting. And then more recently, it's sort of focused around probably more some of the applied questions. So I think one sort of a good example is that idea of what I talked about earlier, that peak vertical velocity during the second pull doesn't explain the entire travel distance of the bar to peak height. So weightlifter has to do additional work on the barbell. So quantifying that,
Mm.
right? It seems like it will be worthwhile just to get an idea, again, descriptively, how much additional work are you doing? Do better weightlifters do more work? Do they do less work? It doesn't seem it's quite that easy, because then we also have the combination of how long that phase is, right? So the time spent during the turnover phase, how fast do you reposition, also seems to play into this. There's some work that was published by the group out of Germany where they looked at the turnover time, and one of the sort of upper limits of that turnover time that they suggested was 400 milliseconds for the snatch. And so in some of the conversations that we have with coaches, some of them are very adamant about trying to, right, they're like, what was the turnover time for this lift? And so we look at it and they're like, oh, I need to get it down. Or it's, we try to decrease it. For other coaches, it might not be as much of an issue. And I think it's really interesting in how that fits in with their sort of philosophical approach to how they think about technique. Sort of similar to what you mentioned, I think, with Max Ada's sort of weightlifting triad, right? I think turnover time, or sort of there's a temporal component to that as well. So that's an example of sort of a more applied question, right? The timing, the velocities, what are some of the things that really matter? Coming back to, again, one of the reasons for going to the American Championships will be to gather some more data in competition, so to do some more in competition analysis. One of the things that we're super interested in is sort of anthropometrical influences on biomechanical variables. And so we did collect some data at the American Open Finals last year in Wilmington as well, and we were hoping to be able to get some measures of segment lengths based off of video analysis. There's a published method in terms of how to do that from single camera views. And so we just ran into some technical issues with our cameras. And so sort of trying that again, I think would be really interesting.
I have a couple of applied questions to kind of round us out, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Let's have them.
So thinking about the contribution of different joints at different phases of the lift, and I think about how I've trained, and I think about you talking about like more of an active contribution to the height of the pole, after you call it the explosion, call it whatever, but like as you're turning the bar over, like a continuation of the pole, maybe with the upper body to help continue moving it up. And I think about, like, my mind immediately goes to like, okay, how are we training to then impact that part of the lift, right? So you talk about like, if we're to talk about the ankles, it's like, you don't see much direct like calf work in the training of weightlifters, if at all. Like the only time I've actually seen it is with a program Sean Waxman wrote. I've programmed it very infrequently, but I'm thinking about like, if we directly target the muscles that contribute to movement at the ankle, and then we directly target, say, the shoulders and arms in a way that could directly target, the pull underneath or pull up of the barbell. Like if we can kind of then start to segment training a little bit, and we, have an agreed upon language when we talk about periodization, we can further out influence those muscles, influence those joints, like maximal strength around those joints, and then influence how the bar moves. Like, that's fantastic, because then we can put more direct training in to influence the trajectory and then like speed of the barbell. Have you thought about it from that applied standpoint of like, okay, if there are these influences at these time points, how can training reflect what we need to make happen to have a higher pull or more efficient pull?
I mean, that's sort of the holy grail in a way, right? It's like trying to do again, this is sort of trying to actively mull this over, right? With all the biomechanical or technical analyses, that's what you want to try to pinpoint bottlenecks, essentially. And that's, again, we've done this in some of our research. The different terms that people use for this, either bottlenecks in muscle function or we try to quantify what's the relative effort of a muscle group. And so, and as an example, so if you're doing a clean, right, at 90% of your 1RM, there probably is a muscle that's working closer to 90%. There might be a muscle, say muscle groups that is only working at 75% of 1RM. And so as the load gets heavier, you get to 95, right? Is it that one muscle group that becomes the bottleneck to overall sort of force production, or to moving the barbell, or imparting enough velocity and acceleration so that you can make the lift? But again, plantar flexors might only be at 50% throughout the entire time, and we don't really know. We don't really have that information, right? And it sort of takes some computational modeling, because you need to account for muscles, again, force length properties, some intrinsic dynamics like load velocity relationships. That sort of conflates all of this, because because we can certainly you could do like an isometric pull in a certain position, right? You could record how much force you're producing, and you could then compare that against how much force are you producing during the actual lift, and get an idea of globally, right? Are you at 90% of maximal force during the dynamic lift as you are during the isometric lift? And so isometrically, it works pretty well. We do want to match for the position that the body's in, right? To account for force length, force length properties. But then also, once you're moving, the faster you're moving, the lower the muscle's sort of capacity to produce force. And so, yeah, it would be great, right, if we could do these analyses and pinpoint exactly what is the limiting factor in this. We've tried to do this. It seems to work okay for the lower extremity. You're talking about the pull or during the turnover phase. There hardly is any work done on upper body contributions or upper body function during the lifts. So that's something that's, again, on the radar screen as well, right? And then something else I was going to say in terms of the example you gave with, sorry, can't think of it right now.
No, and the reason I ask is because when I watch as a coach and I kind of diagnose a lift, where I see a lot of things falling apart is the bar looping away after contact. So it's like if you can correctly execute with the legs, right, and the hips and whatever, coordinate the entire movement, but then kind of like follow the bar up, get a nice long pull under, and like a smoother or more effective turnover. To me, that's like the differentiator between like just kind of lifting well and lifting really, really well and being dialed in. And when I see people start to like, I'm able to kind of program effectively to create that movement, and the athlete can kind of like figure it out conceptually and then make it happen. Like, I think that tends to do a lot for technical consistency, and then just like efficiency, and to where you could see like, okay, your technique isn't falling apart now with 90% lifts. Like, you look reliably a lot better. So that's why I was wondering, because there have been conversations in the weightlifting circles of like, what do you do after contact? How do the arms contribute, or the upper body contribute, or how do these like different parts of the body contribute? And people just speculate and kind of like pick and pull answers from various videos or various athletes, versus having like, no, kind of reliably based on this measurement that can give us a clear image. This is what we see, because visually sometimes things can get fuzzy and you're not quite sure what's exactly happening.
Yeah, and okay, so I remember what I was going to say, and this sort of feeds into this. So your question of how do we then, like, is that those things that we identify, are they coachable? Like, is that still a whole nother sort of question that I don't know, or how easy is that? Like, when you're describing sort of mechanics during the turnover phase, is the lifter actively thinking about this, right? Or how much can you consciously think about this or consciously affect the movement pattern? I don't know. I think that's a great question. from a biomechanical perspective, I often think about like initial conditions. Initial
Mhm.
conditions are probably pretty important. I've had a conversation with some other people about using something more along the lines of path analysis, not path of the barbell, but like analytically thinking about like quantifying all the variables that we can during the first pull, seeing how that influences statistically things during the transition, during the second pull, to get this idea of almost cause and effect, which we're always sort of careful about, right, in the research world. But that's the idea, is that like this path or sequential model of things that you're doing early on in the lift, and that's where we'll come back to initial conditions.
Well, and that's how,
I did.
as a coach, that's how that's how you would attempt to explain it. It's like, okay, if we get into a strong start position and keep the bar close and get
Yeah.
tight correctly, when the bar gets to the knee or when you initiate that transition, the bar is going to get more likely to get to a correct position of the hip, which is more likely to lead to a correct position, kind of pulling and turning it over. So it's like, how do we create the precondition for a successful lift, or the best possible starting point? And I think, kind of to your point about like, what can we influence? And you talk about like, well, if we have this part of the lift set up correctly, does it create a higher probability that we execute it correctly in the next part or segment that we're measuring? I think about the kind of like area of skill acquisition and that idea of like the constraints-led approach. So if you do a lot of like no contact variations of the lift, or not introducing horizontal movement, you have to pull it in a straighter line. You're going to more effectively train those muscles. If we can like oversaturate that movement pattern and you get strong there and you feel like that's a position you naturally orient to, then when you perform the classic lift, it increases the probability or likelihood you find that like movement solution to the problem of like pulling it over your head, basically. So you would oversaturate the program with constraints that would force you to, without thinking, do the lift properly. And that's largely reflected in the way I program for athletes, is like, how do we create the conditions for an effective lift, more effective than what you're currently doing? At some point that might overlay on the classic lift. And you just kind of like, based on the effect, increase frequency, increase specificity. So like load specificity, and then you kind of wait it out, and that's coaching, right? It's kind of like setting up the conditions for a certain effect and seeing if it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have you given much thought to like the skill acquisition space with relationship to all this, given that like you're describing something, how do you effectively change it?
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, I love the conversations around ecological dynamics, right, and the sort of skill acquisition models that are out there, applying them to weightlifting and track and field throwing, to both. Some of the very first time that I've seen sort of application of neural networks, actually, which again we use some of the basic techniques in machine learning for some of the analysis that we've done. But the very first time that I came across these were in the context of differential learning. So I don't know if you've heard of differential learning. It's a sort of theory method of skill acquisition that's probably most prominently put forth, or what's the word? Not propagated, but the guy I think of is Wolfgang Schellhorn. He's a German researcher. And so his name is the one that comes to mind when I think about this. So differential learning, the idea is that you look at the solution space to the movement from a degree of freedom perspective, and you're trying to expose people to as many variations, combinations, right, of the movement, and trying to help them self-optimize into their specific movement pattern to meet that goal. There's another way that it's actually been applied in weightlifting. There's a paper by a research group out of Italy. They use a very similar framework. It's called amplification of movement errors, I think. Amplification of movement errors. So AME, I think is the acronym. And so the idea is that if you have a lifter who isn't able to keep the bar close during the first pull, right, you instruct them, you do your pull, but you try to move the bar as far away from you as possible, right? And the sort of thought process is that the lifter, hopefully light bulb goes on and says, ooh, that felt really bad. I need to keep the bar close.
Interesting.
So I think they had two sort of coaching cues that they did that with. One was horizontal bar movement, and the other one was hips and shoulders, sort of not rising at the same time, so having a very pronounced just leg extension without extending at the hip. So hips rising, right? And so you say like, have your hips shoot up as fast as you can, and then you're sort of grinding out the lift, which is a horrible sort of visual, right? You're grinding out the snatch from a deadlift position. But that's the idea, right? You're trying to present the athlete with different solutions to the movement. And so coming back to Xiaohuan, so they had a sort of pattern recognition, machine learning / neural network, whatever other buzzword you want to insert into there, a way of looking at sort of quantifying movement patterns dynamically throughout the entire trial for multiple degrees of freedom. And I thought that was super cool. And there's also a really interesting video of a guy doing this for shot putting. So if you can probably type in differential learning shot put and it'll come up on YouTube. There was a guy doing like 6 weeks of traditional shot put, sort of just glides across the circle, glides and standing throws. And then in the other one, it's like the most sort of variability that you could think of. And it's a sort of, I think, an interesting thought, right? Is that you're trying to maximize the exposure, I guess, to different ways of performing the same task. There's also a paper that I think it was Xiaohuan's group too, where they applied the same concept in a more strength and conditioning setting. So instead of doing a traditional plyometric or jumping program, that's sort of your typical NSCA sort of guidelines driven 6 weeks progressive overload, right, accommodation, specificity sort of periodization program where we monitor a number of foot contacts and we change things very systematically, as opposed to like every day it's just different, almost pseudo random fluctuations in the sort of way that you're doing the jumping tasks. And what they found is that group actually improved their vertical jump to a greater extent, as well as the carryover or transfer to a sport-specific skill was greater from that as well, from the differential learning application. So I think about this in terms of weightlifting, right? Again, not saying I haven't done this. I don't know if I would suggest anybody else doing this, but exposure to a lot of different exercises, or let me back up. So the example of doing the plyometrics and a lot of different jumping type of exercises, you're probably targeting the muscles slightly different through all the different movement demands. And that seems to have this sort of very specific, very prominent carryover to not just improving straight up sort of jumping or physiological performance, but then also increasing transfer to other tasks. So if you, by extension, right, for weightlifting, that might lead you to consider or think about using a broader range of exercises, working in slightly different setups or under different conditions, and again, sort of related to different philosophies in weightlifting, right? It's probably not the Bulgarian approach to training, but certainly having more variety of exercises, different ranges of motion, different starting positions, different speeds, if you will, different acceleration patterns. Those are all sort of, I think, things to mull over in that context.
I think that completely describes my programming approach without you even knowing anything about
pseudo random.
Yeah, like a lot of it is it's heavily constraint driven, and it's trying to do the same thing 1,000 different ways. So it's like, if we're working on the transition, it's like, can we go from the low blocks with no feet, with no contact, with no hook grip, power, and then it's like, okay, go low hang, go pause mid shin, and it's like we're just trying to overlay 20 different variations of same position or the same phase, and it's effectively teaching, like, through the constraint how to effectively do that. And I think I think that takes a bit of zooming out from this idea of there's not a ton of linearity with it, and it feels like it should be, where it's like, oh, but if we do, high hip snatches, we're going to start shooting our hips up off the floor. And it's like, that makes sense logically. But I think in reality, it's a far more complex system than just like, if I do this consistently, that's going to be my default. I think there's this ability, and I don't know how this is done, through the intention of the athlete to like, not parse it out, but to do something repeatedly and to have that provide feedback and be helpful, but then to switch into a different movement with a different intention and not default to that. So if you did, high butt snatches for a training block, that doesn't mean your hips are going to shoot up off the floor. It means you might use your legs more effectively through the second pull, because then you're having to engage, to execute the transition in that pull phase better. It's like if you do a ton of no contact lifts, it's not like you forget to make contact. And there might be some like reintegration period or like smoothing over, but I just have found them to be largely helpful when used well. So that's exactly how I coach. I mean, not exactly, but very akin to how I would program and coach. We've been going for like an hour and 20 minutes. Which should definitely wrap up, because I could talk to you probably all day, every day, and still not understand what I'm talking about as much as I want to. For people who are interested in like filling the gaps of what we've talked about, contributing to weightlifting from a research, but also like translation perspective, could we send them to your lab? Do you have, positions? Do you have opportunities? What's your kind of like elevator pitch to people who are interested in helping out?
Just reach out. All right.
There you go.
All right. If you want to link to my email, yeah, we don't really have a great lab webpage, which is sort of probably on me.
Yeah.
Again, I have some graduate students who are trying to do a better job than me on social media and posting some of the things that we do. Yeah, reach out. Again, we probably don't want my ResearchGate webpage on that. I do try to do some things on social media, on Twitter primarily.
And are there opportunities, at Marquette, say maybe not the undergraduate level, but the master's level, and then at the like doctoral level, if people are interested?
Yeah, so I guess I would just ask, like, it probably depends on what people would be looking for, right? So we just accepted 2 new PhD students into our lab this semester, and that's all the funding that we had available for PhD students. We do accept master's students on a sort of ongoing basis. We have a new master's program in sports and exercise analytics. That's pretty heavily focused on sort of the intersection of sports science and data. And there's a pretty big biomechanics component to that. Students will be able to do their either a thesis or project in our lab and help with any of the ongoing projects. We have had visiting students as well. So there are some students that have come for either a semester or over the summer and just been around and helped out with stuff. So I would say just reach out. It sort of always depends on what people are looking for, and then be happy to chat with anybody.
Yeah. For everyone who's interested in learning more, checking out more of the work we've mentioned during this podcast, I'll link that down below. If you follow me, you'll probably hear more from Christoph, and we'll kind of hopefully keep this as like a recurring theme. So you can follow me on Instagram at Josh_Phil WL. That's PHILWL. It's Philosophical Weightlifting everywhere else. And we'll catch you all on the next episode of the podcast.